Friends, it's a delight to have you here today. It is wonderful to think about such a rich topic, such as Yirat Elokim, the awe of God, and how that relates to moral conscience, and how that relates to us doing what's right rather than what's popular, and how that relates to us being able to tap in and hear in the moments of complexity and times of uncertainty, how to navigate uncertain times. And we are here with a master teacher and scholar, Dr. Tanya White, who's an international lecturer, writer, and educator with a focus on Tanakh and contemporary Jewish thought. She's a senior lecturer at Matan Women's Institute for Torah Studies and London School of Jewish Studies, and has acted as scholar in residence in the US, the UK, Switzerland, and communities in Israel. Tanya holds a doctorate in Jewish philosophy from Bar Ilan University, which focused on post-Holocaust theology, and is the recipient of fellowship for outstanding students. He was appointed a Sachs Scholar in the inaugural Rabbi Sachs Scholars cohort of 2023-2024. This only scratches the surface. It is a delight to welcome Dr. Tanya White. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Rav Shmuley. Thank you all. Wonderful to be here with you all. And I'm super excited to be teaching for Ori Tzedek. Really, thank you for inviting me. I'm going to jump straight into our topic today. It's a sticky topic in the sense that I think one of the things that we grapple with in our limited human conscience and consciousness is where or how we navigate morality and the Torah. Are the two one and the same? Are they different? What allows us, or in what way can we navigate the certain decisions that we make that may not be so clear in the Torah? And what happens when there's certain statutes or absolute laws that we deem to be absolute from the Torah perspective that perhaps contradict our moral intuition, our ethical, the basis of our ethical decision making? What happens when we're trying to navigate that space? And today I want to talk about that question, but I want to kind of segue into that question from a totally different angle, and that's the angle of Yirat Elokim. What is Yirat Elokim? Right? What does it mean? So first and foremost, when we talk about the idea of Yirat Elokim, we talk about the idea of fear. And I actually wanted to take a step back and say that I meant to do this before, and I actually didn't ask you guys if this is okay, but I'm sure being who you are, you'll understand that this week has been dedicated to the week of goodness that Hirsch's family, the captive Hirsch Goldberg Polin, his family have created this week of all different people doing all different things. I have a kind of personal connection. My daughter is very, very good friends with Orly, who is the sister of Hirsch. So I wanted, if it was okay with you, to dedicate the class this week in the zchut, in the merit that he should be released and should have a complete recovery, both of soul and of body, Hirsch ben Pearl Chana. So sorry, I wanted to segue there because I think this is all super relevant. Today, we're facing so many complex questions. Questions, again, in Israel, we're hearing, do the hostages come first? Does the war come first? Does survival of the nation come first? Does the survival of the individual? These are all extremely complex moral and political and many, many different dilemmas. And the question how we understand these things, how we get there. And one of the main things that I keep going back to, one of the main concepts that in my mind sits at the heart of so many of these decisions is the notion of Yirat Elokim. How do we decide? How do we understand it? So first and foremost, as a basic translation, the idea, the word Yirah means fear of God. I know when I was growing up, I went through I went to a school in London whose teachers came from the more Haredi environment, and they instilled a very deep sense of fear. There was definitely an element of pedagogical underpinning of fear that dictated many of the lessons and many of the kind of outlook of the institution. I remember at one point, I turned around and I thought, it can't be that religion, that my relationship to God is based on fear. I was very young. I don't think I really understood the theological complexity of what that meant, but I knew as a person it didn't sit right, and it was a very long journey for me to realize that when we talk about the idea of Yirat Elokim, we don't necessarily mean fearing God by way of fear of punishment, but there's something much bigger. And this is what I want to talk to about today. If we look for a second, what I want to begin with a couple of quotes. I'm going to share the screen. I'm going to show you some very, very interesting, or at least what I think are very interesting, couple of quotes. First and foremost, we have from Kohelet, Sof davar hakol nishma, et Elohim yir'ah, et mitzvotav shamor, ki ze kol ha'adam. At the end of the day, after having been heard, everything is the fear of God, keeping his commandments, and that is the whole man. Can it really be that everything is based on the idea of the fear of God? And then we have also from Tehillim, Reshit Chochma Yirat Adonai Sechel Tov L'chol Osehem Tilato Omedet Le'ad. The beginning of Chochma, the beginning of wisdom, is the fear of God. All who practice it, all who have fear of God, will have a sechel tov, a good wisdom, a good understanding in everything that they do, and praise him because he is everlasting. Again, what here does the word Yirat Hashem stand for? And then again, in Sefer Dvarim, V'ata Yisrael ma Adonai Elohecha shoel mimech, ki im liyirah Adonai את אדוני אלוהיך, ללכת בכל דרכיו ולאהבה אותו, ולעבוד את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך. What does God want from you? To fear, again, if we translate it away, to fear God. Again, I ask myself the question, is this the whole of man? Fearing punishment, is that everything? And now I want to talk about this idea of fear of God, and I want to pull in a totally different source, and that is someone called Professor Howard Wetstein. Professor Howard Wetstein is or was a philosopher at the University of California. I think he's now retired. He is a wonderful human being who I have personally met over Zoom a few times. And I want to share with you from his book, The Significance of the Religious Experience, the way in which he understands the notion of Yirat Elokim, because I think it's very different for him. And again, Rush really already preempted what I'm going to say by saying Yirat Elokim means the awe of God. And I think that's a much better way of translating it. Let's just share and hear what Howard Wetstein says. He says, we have been exploring ordinary awe experiences for their religious content, and we have hit upon the duality, humble but elevated, a powerful religious idea. But there's more. All experiences, perhaps as a consequence of the duality, characteristically engender a generosity of spirit, a lack of pettiness, increased ability to forgive and to contain anger and disappointment. To feel and behave in these ways is to feel and behave as, according to the tradition, God does. So what is Yirat Elohim? According to Howard Wetstein, it's the idea of being in awe. What does that mean to be in awe? So here, Howard Wetstein draws in, obviously, Rabbi Avraham Yeshua Heschel. For Rabbi Heschel, the idea of Yirah is awe. And we know that the foundation of Rabbi Heschel's thought is the idea of radical amazement. How do we get to God? How do we tap into God's call to us? Through being radically amazed in our day-to-day interaction with the world. That is awe. And for Rabbi Heschel, that is Yirah. And he says in biblical Hebrew, the word sometimes means awe and it sometimes means fear. And in some senses, it has the quality of both awe and fear. Despite some of the standard translations, it's far from clear why simply being frightened of God is supposed to be of great ethical value, or why such a fright is so admirable as to be considered the beginning of wisdom, as we saw. as we are told that Yirat is in Psalms. Many awe experiences, insofar as they involve powerful natural or spiritual forces, involve an element of fear. And here I want to think for a second. I want us to think in our minds of moments in which we've been awed. What happens in those moments of awe? What happens in those moments of awe? If you think about moments in which awe overtakes you, I know the birth of a child standing at the Grand Canyon, right? These moments in which you'll suddenly have this sudden epiphany. And by the way, it can be for many people, it manifests itself in many different experiences. But that awe moment is a combination of fear and awe. Because in some senses, what's born in the awe experience is this sudden fear, this realization that there's something bigger, that there's something transcendent. And that realization of transcendence can often be very frightening. Okay, so that is aligned with yirah, with the awe element. There is also a fear, but it's not, and here we get to the distinction, it's not fear of punishment. It's this existential fear. And this is what Howard Wetstein speaks about. In awe and amazement, the prophets stand before the mystery of the universe, writes Heschel. Nor is it just the prophets. We often feel awe at things that seem beyond our comprehension. Childbirth, the birth of ideas or art. Mystery then is closely related to awe, where mystery is understood in terms of wonderment and the sense that we are in over our heads. And then he speaks about the idea of how we become Yirei Shamayim. What is it to be a person who is God-fearing? And he talked about the notion of character development. Character development is something in which a person who becomes a Yirei Shamayim, a person who becomes an awed, a person who's fearful of heaven, doesn't come through fear of punishment. In some senses, that's a very infantile way of understanding the world. A child fears punishment, but an adult doesn't necessarily fear punishment. An adult understands that they are part of a matrix of existence that's far greater than them, and they feel a responsibility to that interaction, to that much larger compass that exists. And this is what Howard Wetstein is talking about. So how do we engender such a beautiful way of living? We have to make it habitual. It has to become part of our day-to-day living. And listen to what he says. He says as follows: what is distinctive about the Yirei Shamayim is not merely a distinctive object of awe, an explicitly religious object, but rather, and here I'm going to skip a little bit, is the idea of the steadiness. All while not a constant companion, has become characteristic of an everyday experience. It's not only a question of frequency. The Yirei Shamayim lives in the presence of awe, a kind of background condition against which he carries on. Nor is it only awe that has become characteristic or habitual. With awe comes the godlike tendencies to feeling and behavior. The perspective, subspecies eternitasi, the gratitude. Moreover, since awe engenders a sense of holy, to characteristically feel awe is to be confronted by the holy in all sorts of unlikely places. Okay? And this is what Howard Wetstein develops. What does it mean to be a Yirei Shamayim? And for him, and here he has a footnote that he speaks about this, emunah, faith, is not blind faith. It's not a faith in convictions or propositions. Rather, it's a commitment. It's a steadfastness. It's a trust. I would call it, in the language that I like to use, the language of people like Rav Yitzchak Greenberg, maybe Rabbi Sachs, it's the idea of a covenantal commitment. I am committing myself to something beyond myself. And so now I come back to this question again. why then often when we talk about the idea of Yirat Elokim, we talk about the idea of fear of God? So the Rambam also, it's not just Howard Wetzstein, who obviously is a contemporary modern philosopher, and we can argue, yes, he's using modern categories of, that are more palatable to our modern or even postmodern proclivities. But I want to draw it back already even much more ancient to the Rambam. The Rambam already begins to develop this idea. Listen to what the Rambam says. He says, what is the way that one can love and fear God? In the moment in which he reflects, right, or ruminates. Man ruminates on the greatness of the creation and the work of God, right? שאין לה ערך ולא פץ מיד, הוא אוהב ומשבח ומפאר ומתאווה תאווה גדולה, right? When he reflects on all these great things, he will become Yiramihen, he will become fearful of them. And again, here, fearful is not a good translation. He will be in awe. That's really what it is. He will be in awe of them and their greatness and their chokhmah and their wisdom, their knowledge. And he will realize there is nothing like them and there is no end to what God has created. And he will love and he will praise and he will long and he will have this deep thirst for God, right? And he continues and he says, when we think about all these things, we will be stricken with awe. Right, that is what it is. He will suddenly realize, he will have this moment of epiphany in which he realizes, or woman, that she is this very small, tiny creation and almost this dust in the presence of something so much greater. And that says the Rambam, that is the moment when Yirat Elokim is born. It's not the moment where God says to us, you will be punished if you don't do X, Y, Z. That's not Yirat Elokim, says the Rambam. Yirat Elokim comes in the moment in which we are awestruck, in which we have this sudden epiphany that we are part of something much bigger than ourselves. And now I want to segue into where we see the idea of Yirat Elokim in the Torah, because I don't want us just to take it from Howard Wetzstein, who is a brilliant philosopher, and the Rambam, who was absolutely, obviously we know, unbelievably brilliant erudite philosopher of the Middle Ages. I want us to look at the Torah itself, to look at the origin, the core origin of the idea of Yirat Elokim. And I want to bring in a few different examples of where we see it. First and foremost, we see that the phrase is used by Yosef. It is used by Joseph, when the brothers come down and he takes he says to the brothers, I am going to hold Binyamin, I think it's actually, I'm going to hold, he holds Shimon, and the brothers say to him, how can we trust you? And he says, he takes them into the prison for 3 days. Do this and you will live. Et ha'elohim ani yireh. I fear God. What's he saying to them? He's saying, and again, they don't know. The brothers at this stage have no idea who Joseph is. They don't know who he is. He's still, to them, he's still the second in command in Egypt. He is Egyptian. He looks Egyptian. He speaks Egyptian. For all they know, he is simply Egyptian. And what does he say to them? He uses seemingly religious language. He says, you can trust me because I'm God-fearing. So then we have to ask the question, what does it mean to be someone who fears God? What does that mean? And why does he say, you can trust me because I fear God? Right? Look at source number 4. He turns around and he says to them, V'yomer alehem Yosef al tira'u, do not fear, ki atachat Elohim ani. Do not fear that I'm in the place of God. Do not fear that I'm going to punish you. Here again, the yirah, he is relating to the brothers' understanding of yirah. brother's understanding of Yirat is fear of punishment. And he says, don't fear. I'm not going to punish you. God is not a punishing God. Atem chashabtem alai ra'ah. You thought everything you did and was bad, but God thought for it good. I know, says Yosef, that God isn't someone who is just punishing God. God is someone who understands that the development of the moral character is what leads to true yirah. I want to show you a second example. The second example, as we know, is the first example of civil disobedience that we see in the ancient world. We have these midwives who are told by Pharaoh to kill the newborn Israelite babies. And instead, what do? Instead, they allow these newborn babies to live. Now, we do not know if Shifra and Pua, as they're called in the verses. We do not know exactly if they are the Meyaldot HaIvriyot, if they are Israelite midwives, or if they are midwives to the Israelite, meaning they are Egyptians. We don't know. It seems to be, it's more likely, it seems from the text, that they are, in fact, Egyptian midwives. And therefore, what is unbelievable about them? What is unbelievable is that they would go against the decree of their king. They would go against the conformity that the rest of their nation, right, are conforming to this immoral dictatorship. And they will act instead for the good, for the moral, for the ethical. And look at what the text says. And again, I want us to note the play here in the Hebrew language. When they see the babies on the stones, if says the Pharaoh to the midwives, when you see the baby on the rocks, if it is a ben, kill. If it's a boy, kill him, and if it's a girl, he shall live. V'tira'en hamiladot. And now we would think it would be that when they saw the babies, but it isn't. When Elokim, when these midwives feared God, but it could be read either way. It could be read when they saw or when they feared. There is already what we're seeing here is a fascinating thing, which we're going to begin to understand and develop. And that is the relationship between seeing and awe. Seeing and awe. If we go back a minute to Howard Wetstein, who told us that the idea of being a Yirat Elokim, a Yirat Hashem, someone who fears God, is the idea not of this fear of punishment, but rather a development of character. It's this idea, if we draw in to Heschel's understanding of radical amazement, of feeling the presence of something greater in our midst. But this notion of a Yirat Elokim, a Yirat Elokim personality, it doesn't occur overnight. It requires adherence to a lifestyle, to a consistent lifestyle and a steadfastness in our emunah, in our development of a relationship with a transcendent being and a transcendent idea and thing. Therefore, if we look now for a minute at these midwives, what is happening here? What we seem to see is that the midwives have an experience of reality in which they become fearful of God, not through punishment, because they see something beyond. There is a vision, there is a sight, there is seeing something beyond the given that allows them to save these babies, that allows them to tap in to their inner conscience, that tells them there's more than this law, this gzeira of Paro, this decree of Paro. And they see it, and they fear God, and they save the babies. And I want to just show you how this word, tereh, to see, the verb to see, comes up again and again when we're talking about all of these women in the Exodus, the women of the Exodus, who in essence, bring about the redemption. Here we're talking about Yocheved, who gives birth to Moshe. He sees the child, and she becomes pregnant, she has a child, and she sees that he is good. And then, but Paro, the daughter of Paro, comes down to wash in the Nile, and she walks along the Nile. And what happens? She sees the basket. And what does she see? She sees the child. She sees the child crying, has mercy upon him, and then she says it's an Israelite. Something profound is happening in all of these instances. And that is that all of these people see beyond the given. But Paro sees beyond the Israelite baby who needs to be killed. She sees the child, she sees the humanity. These people are able to fight against the conformity of the age because they have Yirat Elokim. They have a fear of God, and the fear of God is not fear of punishment, because then they would be fearing the punishment of the decree of Paro. It's not a fear of an external constraint. Instead, it's an awe that is engendered within, because they understand that they are part of something bigger than the here and the now. So this notion of Yirat Elokim, which traditionally often is understood as fear of punishment, fear of God, as an external fear of the punishments and the laws, actually, if we look at it carefully in the Torah, it seems to imply something much more internal. It's a sense, an internal orientation towards the ethical conscience. Something internally, a voice, an inner ethical drive is telling me that I need to recognize this, what's happening around me is not right, and I need to act against what is happening around me. And again, here, look what happens. We continue with the theme. I'm going to skip to the case of Abraham and Avimelech for the sake of time. And here it's fascinating. And here I want to get to the Akeida. This is our central analysis. And through this, we're going to really try and get to the heart, to the root of what Yirat Elokim is. First and foremost, let's think for a second. So far, what have we done? We've seen the idea of Yirat Elokim as the idea of a moral internal conscience that is engendered through an awe experience and then is sustained in the routine of a sustainable relationship, a covenantal relationship between God and man. That's how it works. We saw for the Rambam, Yirat Elokim is the idea of me coming to God not through fear, through an experience in which I understand that there is something bigger than the self. And that moment of epiphany, of transcendence, allows me, guides me to an awe experience in which from there, I build up my relationship of ahava, of the love of God. We saw examples in the Torah, Yosef, the midwives, the women in Sefer Shmot, where there's a relationship between the idea of yirah, which is traditionally translated as fear, but let's call it awe, and the idea of vision, ter'eh, to see. Because yirah, fear, because awe can often come through us recognizing that there is more, that there is a mystery to our existence, that what is seen is not always what is, that there is more than the given. That transcendence, that tapping in to a sense of transcendence, to seeing beyond, that is that is the moment in which awe, in which Yirah is born. So that's why the relationship of Tereh and Yirah come together. And now I want us to look at the case of Abraham and the Akeida. We know at the very, very end of the Akeida story of the sacrifice of Abraham, we have God turns around to Abraham and says to him, now I know that you're God-fearing, and that's the end of the story. And it always perplexed me. I just, obviously the Akeida is one of the most, I don't even know how to put it, one of the most disturbing narratives, right, in the Torah. I think. At least I see it that way on so many different levels. And we don't have time today to get into why it's so disturbing, but on the very most basic level, it's disturbing because of God's commands, and it's disturbing because of Abraham's response. Okay, both of those are disturbing. But to me, that it's a mystery because more than anything, the text is so enigmatic. It's not as though the text came along and gave us the answer to the story. It's like almost like it's a riddle, and it's up to the reader, up to the person reading it and interpreting it to solve the riddle, or at least to try and navigate the riddle. And in my mind, one of the key kind of tools to solving the riddle is the words at the end of it, where God turns around to Abraham and says, "Now I know you're God-fearing." Why is that the key? Because obviously there was a reason for him to go through all of this. There's a reason for us as the reader to kind of follow Abraham on his journey up that mountain and go through all of these. And then at the end, God says, "Now I know you're God-fearing," and that's the end of the story. And by the way, God never speaks, at least not in the Torah, ever speaks to Abraham again after this. So then the question is, okay, this was, as according to Chazal, according to the rabbis, Abraham has 10 tests. This is the last test. He passes it. Very good, Abraham. You can go on your own now. And it seems to be that he really can go on his own. God doesn't speak to him anymore. So what is going on here? I'm going to already answer it at the beginning, so not to leave you wondering. And then I'm going to get into understanding why I propose what I'm proposing. I believe that this test shows us that Abraham is ready to go into the world on his own without God holding his hand. What do I mean? Until this moment, we see many, many external commands to Abraham and explicit conversations between God and Abraham, or commands, or whatever you want to call them, conversations between God and Abraham. This is the moment in which God realizes, or at least I should say, the Torah portrays God as realizing that Abraham is ready to do this alone. Why? Because now he's God-fearing. Therefore, the clue to understanding what test he had to pass comes in the word Yirat Elokim. And in order to unpack the riddle, or maybe even to make the riddle even more riddled, okay, we need to look at the last time before this that we see the word Yirat Elokim. And where is that? It comes in the text that almost immediately precedes the Akeida, and that is the story of Abraham and Avimelech. And here I want to share what happens. There's a famine in the land, and Abraham goes down to a place called Gra with Sarah, and there he pretends for the second time that Sarah is his sister. And what happens? What's he doing there? He's pretending that Sarah's his sister because why? If she's his sister, they won't kill Abraham. Now, again, there's many, many things for us to put in place here. Abraham is battling with two values. One is the value of the continuation of the chosen people, of the covenant with God, which has to continue through Abraham, so the survival of himself and his nation. And the other is the ethical imperative to protect his wife. And he is grappling with these. Again, does it sound familiar? Of course it sounds familiar, because all of us, all the time, we're always grappling with opposing values, with opposing principles, ethical principles that we are constantly, because that's the messiness of being a human being. Things are not black and white. There's, as Kant says, right, there's categorical imperatives. No, there aren't always categorical imperatives. Sometimes things are messy. And Abraham exists in many, many messy areas. And the messy area he exists in at that moment is, do I put my life on the line and tell them that Sarah's my wife and they'll kill me to get to her? Or do I say that Sarah's my sister, basically opening her up to danger, but yet continuing the godly given covenant with myself? These are exactly the same dilemmas that as a nation we face today at this moment, okay? And he chooses the survival of the nation, the survival of himself, but he doesn't account for the fact that maybe the people he is meeting with are actually, in fact, quite moral people. And they are, because look what happens. V'yomer elav Elohim b'chalom. God comes to Avimelech and says to him, גם אנוכי ידעתי כי בתם לבבך עשית זאת, ואחסוך גם אנוכי אותך מחטאו לי, על כן לא נתתיך לנגוע עליה. He says to him, I am coming to you and I am telling you this because I know I'm going to withhold you from sinning, right? I want to stop you from sinning and therefore, from sinning against me, and therefore, I'm going to tell you that you shouldn't touch her. I'm telling you that she is not, this is his wife. And then Avimelech calls Abraham. V'yomer ma asita lanu, ma chatati lach, ki abeta elai mamlachti chat'a gdola. He turns around to Abraham. He says, "Why have you caused me and my kingdom to sin? Ma'aseh asher lo yasu asiti imadi." V'yomer Avimelech el Abraham ma ra'ita. And again, look at the word used. What did you see? What did you see in my place, in my kingdom, that caused you to do this to me? V'yomer Abraham, ki amarti rak ein yirat Elohim b'makom hazeh, v'harguni al davar ishti. He turns around and he says, I feared that there is no fear of God in this place, and I was worried that you were going to kill me for my wife. What is going on here? What is going on is very simple. Abraham realizes that, or at least Abraham thinks, he judges these people that they're going to kill his wife if he's married to her, to get to her. Kill him to get to his wife. And therefore, what does he do? He lies. Avimelech says to him, no, we're not like that. We actually are God-fearing. And what does it mean, God-fearing? God-fearing here is the idea, once again, of an inner conscience, of the idea that there is something transcendent. I want to just think for a second about what's common in all of these stories, the Yosef stories, the midwife stories, the story of Avimelech. First and foremost, what we see is there's stories where people are hiding their identities. Okay, the midwives, are they Jewish? Are they not Jewish? They have to hide Moshe. Okay, in every one of them, we see that the idea of Yirat Elokim is related to this idea of hiddenness, of mystery, okay, of putting someone in danger. It's about the idea of a higher ideal. In all of these instances, the people are acting in an environment that seems at least antithetical to the basic moral, ethical grounding foundations. Okay, and when they act with Yirat Elokim, they're acting out against this unethical system. Again, one of the other things we see is that all these people are not Jewish. They're not responding to a command, to the Torah. Okay, there's many different things that are going on here, but I think one of the things that we see here that is so clear is that there is a movement between an external command and an internal conscience. Yirat Elokim, in every single one of these instances, at least in my mind, at least the way that I see it, seems to denote an internal ethical orientation that is not related to any religious affiliation. Okay, none of the people here that when we're talking about the idea of Yirat Elokim, none of them are Jewish in the classic sense. None of them have stood at Har Sinai and got the Torah. In fact, we don't see that any of them actually in any way are responding to an external command. On the contrary, many of them are responding against an external command. And so what are they responding to? They're responding to something within. And now I want to take us to the story of the Akeida. The story of the Akeida begins with God calling to Abraham, Lech Lecha, again, a second Lech Lecha, and he says to him, take your son up to this mountain. And Abraham does, but his only response is Hineni. He's very silent. And it's also fascinating, why did he argue when it came to Sodom, and why does he not argue here? Again, these are all big questions. But it seems to be that Abraham hears God, or at least he thinks he hears God, and he begins this journey up the mountain. But one thing we see about him the whole time, and this to me is absolutely fascinating, we keep hearing the verb to see. He sees the mountain from far. He's seeing this, he's seeing that. Abraham never stops seeing. He does not lock himself in a prison of his own sight, of his own convictions. He allows himself to constantly be looking outwards, to constantly be looking. And that ability to see beyond, which is what we've spoken about, that ability to continually climb up the mountain, move beyond, see something more, that allows him to see what? To see something other than the immediacy of the command that God gave him. And what does he do? He hears the voice of the malach. Now, what do we know? The malach, the angel. What do we know about angels? We don't know all that much. Rambam suggests that the angel is an inner voice, that the angel is something that we hear. It's a sense of prophecy that we only hear if we are connected with a higher vision of reality. That's what Abraham hears. Look what God says to him. V'yikra elav malach Adonai min hashamayim v'yomer Abraham, Abraham v'yomer hineni. V'yomer al tishlach yadcha al hanal, al ta'aseh lo me'uma, ki ata yadati ki yireh Elohim ata. Now I know that you are God-fearing. Lo chashachta et bincha yichinzecha mimeni. You did not withhold. Again, note the same word as with Abimelech. You didn't withhold your son from me. What is the angel saying to him? That I think it could be read in many different ways. It could be read not withhold, but it could also be read you did not withhold as a double negative. And if we read it that way, it seems to be the fact that the malach is coming and saying to him, you are hearing me because you are leaving yourself open to the possibility that you may not need to sacrifice your son. And then one more time, he lifts up his eyes and he sees he sees the eye, what allows him to put something in place of his son, the ability to see. There is many things that we can talk about here, and there are many ideas that I think are rooted in the notion of the Akeida, in this narrative of the Akeida. I think one of the big things that we see is that what the movement up the mountain, the movement of Abraham at this moment, is a movement from an external command to an internal conscience. When we talk about morality, it cannot be only one. Torah shebichtav gives us the external command. We are standing at Har Sinai, we get the Torah from God. It's an external command, it's absolute, it's written, and it's non-negotiable. But together with the written law, the absoluteness of the written law, we were given also the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law. And the oral law allows us to take the written law and interpret it for any given moment. And in order to do that, we also have to rely on our own inner conscience. But we have to have both together. And that to me is the journey of Abraham. The journey of Abraham is a journey from the external law to the internal conscience, and not the opposite way round. If we think about how a child grows up first and foremost with the idea of, I don't do something because I'm going to be punished. But ultimately, that is not sustainable for an adult. An adult needs to draw, adult needs to have become inspired and create and make decisions, not just based on punishment, an external law, but also based on something that is developed, a character development. And that is a lifelong journey. That is the journey of Abraham. Now God says to Abraham, I know you're God-fearing. When you turned round and you said to Avimelech, right, you're not God-fearing, that was wrong. Because actually, as it happens, Avimelech was God-fearing. And you, Abraham, didn't realize that people also, even if they don't have an external command, people can also have an internal orientation to the ethical. It's not just about listening to the voice of authority. It's also about listening to something within. And I want to draw you to what Nechama Leibovitz talks about, which is beautiful. She speaks about the idea of Amalek. And again, if we think about Amalek, why are the Amalek the antithesis of the Jewish people, the antithesis of everything against what God stands for, because they were not God-fearers. What does it mean to be God-fearers? It wasn't that they didn't fear punishment of God. It's that they didn't even have the most basic moral, inner, ethical conscience. Listen to what Nechama Leibovitz says when she talks about the idea of Amalek. Here we can see Lo Yirat Elokim. They were not, the people were not God-fearing, so Amalek attacks them. Listen to what Nechama Leibovitz. All the wonders and miracles of Egypt and the Red Sea had come to publicize the omnipotence of God. Indeed, when the children of Israel went out to Egypt, all the nations of the world, with the exception of Amalek, were seized with dread and awe. The people have heard, they tremble. The mighty men of Moab are seized by fright. Mankind as a whole might have taken one great step forward and acknowledged the sovereignty of God of justice and truth. Then Amalek comes in, unrestrained by the dread and the awe that kept all the nations in check, and jumped in, as it were, into the boiling cauldron. What was there to fear? They were wandering in the wilderness, weary and struggling. Why should they not be attacked and spoiled? This is the way of the world. In this moment, in this manner, the moment of awe of the mighty hands of God passed away, and the atmosphere of astonishment at his miracles evaporated. And look what she says later. Accordingly, fear of God is no small matter. On the contrary, its possession constitutes a very high spiritual achievement indeed, which Abraham attained only after withstanding all his trials. Indeed, God does not demand from us this supreme standard, but he demands of us the fulfillment of his will in daily acts, in the grey routine of our 24-hour living. It is the latter which will gradually lead us to a higher plane of fear. What does that mean, a higher plane of fear? That is the journey that Abraham had to make. Abraham had to make the journey from the Yirat Elokim, which is an external command, which is the fear perhaps on a more basic level, to the internal conscience. That is the journey of the Akeida. And in order to tap into our internal conscience, we have to always be open. Our eyes have to be aware of everything around us, aware of someone's suffering, aware of something that's unjust, even if it comes from an external command, an absolute command. We must never blind ourselves to the suffering of someone. We must never blind ourselves to endless possibilities of the interpretive gesture and the interpretive act. Harold Shulwitz, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, very well-known rabbi, was a very well-known rabbi in America. He again emphasizes this idea of Yirat Elokim. And he says that the Jewish understanding of the fear of God bears connotations different from other theological outlooks. For Judaism, fear of God suspends the unethical command and liberates the believer from the bondage of spiritual literalness. Now, if we think for a second about Akeida Yitzchak, Abraham thinks he hears a command. Now, we left Aviva Zornberg behind, but she beautifully tells us that the Zohar says that the command of the Akeida came to Abraham through a dim glass. It wasn't as clear as all the other commands God had given him. That the Zohar implies that Abraham wasn't 100% sure about the command God gave him. And so he had to constantly interpret it. He had to constantly be open to interpretation. So too, says Harold Shulwitz, the Torah sometimes gives us certain commands that if we take them literally, we're not interpreting them in the right way. As a human being, demanded of us is the interpretive gesture, is the critical conscience. For many, says Harold Shulwitz, God and conscience are opposite, and to choose one is to surrender the other. In our view, fear of God is fear of self-betrayal and the self-gifted with moral judgment. To suppress conscience is to ignore the core divine-human relationship. The proper fear of God is expressed in the love of moral conscience. I'm going to skip a little bit. He says, conscience is the internal moral sense that remains when the formal conditions for halachic prosecution are absent. And I'm going to finish essentially, even though I did want to develop a little more the idea of Amalek, but I see that our time is up. I'm going to finish with Rav Yitzhak Greenberg, and then I'm just going to develop for 1 minute the idea of Amalek, and with that, we're going to end. Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg, in his upcoming book, Please God, I don't know if this made the cut of the book, but this was something manuscript he sent to me, and with his permission, I'm sharing it. He says, analyzing Camus' criterion, I have come to use the category Yirat Elokim, which literally means the fear or the awe of God, to define people's religious stance. This term is borrowed from scriptures. Asked why he lied and said that Sarah was not his wife, Abraham says, as we saw, right, I feared there wasn't any Yirat Elokim in this place. Unprovoked, the people Amalek attacked the rear column, the weak and the tired stragglers of the Israelites in the desert, because the people were not Yirat Elokim. They didn't fear God. The fear of God isn't a formal category of religion. It's a kind of primordial force field of invisible divine presence. It deters people's aggression and protects life. When people encounter and feel this force field, they find that they cannot kill men to possess their wives, nor can they attack the weak and defenseless. And with that, I want to take it back to the idea of how we fight Amalek. If Amalek represent the idea of the people who do not fear God, how do we fight that? And that, by the way, is, I believe, is what we are fighting today. When there is a people who do not fear God, not only do they not fear the external law, or any external categories of law, not only do they not fear the formal punishment that might come from a divine being that will punish them for not adhering to the law, they actually don't even have the moral orientation, the moral conscience, the moral guidance of awe, of the idea that there's something beyond, of transcendence. How do you fight that mindset? And how do you fight that worldview? And the answer is very simple. The answer comes in the Torah when we fight Amalek for the first time. Look what happens. Amalek comes and the people have to fight in Refidim. And Moshe says to Yoshua, "Bachar lanu anashim, choose men and go and fight them tomorrow." And says Moshe, Anochi nitzav al rosh hagivah, I will stand on the top of the mountain with my rod in my hand. And Yoshua did exactly what Moshe did, and they went and they fought. And Moshe and Aaron and Hur go to the top of the mountain. And it was when Moshe's hands were raised, V'gava Yisrael, the people were victorious. And when his hands were down, Amalek was victorious. And Moshe's hands were heavy. They took a stone to put under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands one side to one side, and his hands were Yadav Emunah. His hands were the hands of Emunah, translated today as faith. This isn't propositional faith. This isn't dogma. This isn't I believe in XYZ. No. What is this? This is covenantal faith. What is covenantal faith? And the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah says to us, was this miraculous that when the hands were up, they were victorious, and when they were down, they weren't? No, the Mishnah says this is nothing to do with a miracle. This is what we call today, and here I'm going to stop share for a minute. This is what we call today the idea of Yirat Elokim. And we might even call it moral. And we might even call it, as I've heard many, many secular Israelis call it, the spirit of the people. What do they mean when they say the spirit of the people? They mean exactly this. They mean that the people's eyes were focused on heaven. When Abraham walked up the mountain, his eyes were focused. They were looking. When the 2 midwives in Egypt were told to kill the babies, they looked, they saw. When the women in Egypt, including the daughter of Paro, saw the human being, the baby, that is what it is to have your eyes open, to see beyond, to understand that this world isn't just what is in front of me, but there is something transcendent, that it's something mysterious that I can't always see with my eyes, but I know it exists because my eyes are open beyond the limitations of my human cognition. That is what it is to fight Amalek with my eyes up to the top of the mountain. Moshe's hands raised, held up by community. Paul and Aaron hold his hands up. Faith is not a solitary a movement. It's not a solitary mission. Faith is a mission of community. It is a mission in which people hold us up. We are held by others. It is a mission in which we have our eyes up to heaven because we are constantly saying there is more to the world than what is given in front of us. It is something that allows us to fight the ideology that's antithetical to our own inner conscience, to our own belief, both in the law that comes as an external voice and to the conscience that comes as an inner voice, and to know that there is always a human possibility of navigating both of those areas, even when it looks messy. That is Yirat Elokim. In my mind, Yirat Elokim supersedes in many, many ways the idea of just fearing God through punishment. It's the next stage in development. It's the mature development. Mature development, Yirat Elokim, and of faith. And with that, I'm going to end. And I really believe in my mind today more than ever, and here I'm going to draw it back to the situation we are in today, because I, for one, at least, can't share Torah today without talking for a moment about where we are as a nation, as a people, both in the diaspora and in Israel. I am particularly here in Israel at the moment, but I know many of you in the diaspora as well. We're all facing really an unprecedented situation, at least in my lifetime, where we are being attacked on every front. And I think the way in which we fight this war, which is a war that is striking at the heart of Yirat Elokim, right, is that we have to fight it by really keeping our eyes up to heaven. What does that mean? It means, for the religious person, the belief in a God, the belief in transcendence, the belief that we are working with God, boots on the ground, eyes up in heaven, knowing there's a bigger picture. And for those that are not necessarily religiously oriented, it's the belief, as many of my secular friends say, of the spirit of the people, of the spirit that we know that we have survived and we continue to survive because we believe in something bigger than just the I. So with that in mind, I say that the idea of Yirat Elokim stands as one of the most foundational principles, I think, both in the Bible and today in our modern Jewish theology. And I hope at least I've tried to share with you how we see this, but in both of those aspects, in both the biblical grounding, obviously through the Rambam in the medieval, and certainly in modern theology. So with that, I will finish. If there are any questions, I'm more than happy to take them.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. And the beautiful class and the way you recapped it at the end, the beautiful message, I'm very happy to have heard all that. And yeah, if we don't have any questions, we'd like to be considerate of everybody's time. So I guess we'll give it a few seconds to see. We got a question.
I didn't catch the double negative.
So it's there is a lo chasachta mimeni and I have to find it. I had it before on my source sheet and it came out. There is a commentator who speaks about the idea that because it's lo chasachta, it's this, you didn't withhold. The withholding and the didn't acts as a double negative. Now, I have to say, syntax is not my thing. It's way beyond my pay grade. But, and it's very important. It's very important. But I have to, and I apologize because I thought it was on the source sheet and it isn't. I have to go back and find exactly where it is. But it's important in understanding, because he says to him, now I know you're God-fearing. So that works with my theory, obviously, the idea of God-fearing and the idea of relating it to Avimelech. The idea of you didn't withhold your son, what does that mean? And it's a problem. It's a problem in understanding it, because it seems to suggest that one of the things God wanted to see is that Abraham was willing to give up his son. Now, again, In my mind, from a more ethical perspective, that problem is very simply solved. Every single time God speaks to Abraham till this moment is dependent on something. Abraham could be seen to be listening to God because God has given him a promise. At the beginning, when he tells him, Lech Lecha, he promises you'll be a great nation. At the beginning, even when he tells him to Brit Milah, you'll be a great nation, you'll be, you'll serve. This is the only time that God says to him, do something without any promise afterwards. And he's asking him actually to sacrifice the very, very thing he promised him. So in my mind, that is Abraham essentially responding to God saying, I know that ultimately nothing is in my control. And I am not worshiping you because I know I'm going to get a reward or because I know that you're going to give me something in response. I'm worshiping you because I believe in you 100%. So in some senses, it still works with the theory. Abraham is saying, my belief in God is not dependent on anything. Okay, the place it doesn't work, and I agree with you on this, is the idea of the moral and ethical imperative. What about his son? What about the idea of, what's he choosing here? Is he choosing God or is he choosing his son? Now, Rav Benny Lau has a most beautiful article, which I personally really identify with, where he talks about the idea of Abraham's two hinenis. Hineni to God and Hineni b'ni, that he says when Yitzchak says, where is the thing? And he says, Hineni b'ni. First he says to him, Avi, and he says, Hineni b'ni. And Rav Benny Lau says that in a way, the entire journey up that mountain is the rumination that Abraham is going through between the Hineni to God and the Hineni b'ni to his son. And I want to tell you that today, and here I say maybe we're judgmental of Abraham. We say, how could he ever have taken his son up to sacrifice his son, etc., etc. And I have to tell you today, I look at my daughter's in the army. I look at many, she's, thank God, she's not a fighting chayelet, but all of our friends, we lost a very, very dear friend, boy from the Moshav, who was my daughter's best friend. And I think about his family, and I think about the fact that they walked their son up that mountain and their son died. Okay, it wasn't that he was saved like Yitzchak. And I think to myself, yes, we look at Abraham and from our almost postmodern, but I would even say our modern ethical orientation, we say, how dare Abraham do such a thing? But why do we so-called sacrifice our children, right? Not obviously, we don't want them to die. No one wants any child to die. But we know that our survival is dependent on our children going out and fighting our enemies who have no Yirat Elokim, right? And there I say, therefore, the fact that Abraham allows himself to remain open to all possibilities, that he doesn't close his eyes, that he doesn't become narrow, that he doesn't become fundamentalist in his interpretation of the situation, but he allows himself to hear the malach. Remember, it's not God that comes to him at the end, it's the malach that comes to him at the end. And that to me is the chidush, the novelty of this whole story. And what is so radical about the story is that in the end, Abraham listens to the voice of the angel and not the voice of God. If he was to listen to the voice of God, he would have told the angel, I'm not listening to you, you're not God. But he doesn't. He listens to the voice of the angel. Why? Because that's where he really wants to respond to the Hineni B'ni and not to the Hineni, because the Hineni doesn't add up in his mind. And therefore he opens his eyes up to hear the malach talking to him, to see the ram in the thicket, so that he can use the ram instead of his son. And that to me is the novelty. When God says to him, the angel says to him, you didn't hold back your son, the angel saying to him, I know that you wanted to sacrifice. I know that you believe in the mission of the Jewish people, and that's unbelievable. I'm not going to make you do that, because that's not the end goal. The end goal is not to sacrifice your son. The end goal is not to be a martyr. The end goal in our religion is life. That's the end goal. So it's very, very complicated, and it's messy. It's messy because we have to make that call. Do we listen to the literal interpretation of the law? Do we listen to the interpretation? Do we listen to the secondary, the malach? Do we listen to God? Do we see the eyal? Do we ignore it? What do we see? When is awe more important than law? These are all big questions. And I don't propose to have definitive answers to these questions. I don't think anyone does. And I think that's part of our job as human beings. By the way, we mess up. We sometimes mess up, as did Abraham on a few occasions. We can talk about that another time. But I think our role as human beings is dafka to walk that very messy, messy bridge between inner ethical conscience and external authoritative law, and to know when to listen to which voice.
Thank you.
Long answer to a short question.
I want to see the this source that you're referring to.
I will try and find it as best that I will go searching now on my computer for it.
Thank you. Thank you. Shakoach.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you for listening.
This is amazing. If that's all, we can end the Zoom. And one more time, thank you so much, Dr. Tanya.
Thank you, Isaac, and thank all of you for coming and listening. Be well.
You too. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.